the more cash strapped you are, right, the more frugal you get and the more brainy you get. So I mean, your brain will have to lose to all your neurons only if you are actually stopped with money, right? So that's why necessity is the mother of invention.
Thank you for joining Change I Am Possible, which is India's first future tech podcast. Sincerely appreciate it. Honored to have you, Professor. So for the listeners who don't know about you, I'm going to give them like a little brief and then we'll jump right into the conversation. So Professor Satyanarayan Chakravarti is Professor of Aerospace Engineering at the Indian Institute of Technology, Madras. He has served as a postdoctoral fellow at Georgia Tech. Professor Chakravarti's interest lies in the field of energy and combustion. He has over 75 publications in international journals and over 230 papers in international and national conferences. He has won the Young Engineer Award from the Indian National Academy of Engineering, Young Faculty Recognition Award from IIT Madras, DRDO Academic Excellence Award, Dalmia HEMSI ACH REM Award in the High Energy Materials. He was a member of the editorial board of the Progress in Energy and Combustion Science Journal. He has also served as a colloquium co-chair on solid fuels combustion at the 37th International Symposium on Combustion at Dublin, Ireland. Besides that, he is a mentor for Avishkar Hyperloop, founder at the National Center for Combustion Research and Development, co-founder at Agnikul Cosmos, co-founder at Aerostrovelos Energy Private Limited, co-founder at ePlane AI. Really a pleasure and honor to have you, Professor. So let's start with COVID. I mean, from my vantage point of view, because I've been invested in ARD, I see a fundamental change because of COVID, and I think it's disrupted the education industry. Like the education industry, which is or rote learning education industry, has been on a slow decline, and then you see that at the same point. We have, internet, which is full of education, free MOOCs, right? Massive open online courses, which is available free online. So somehow I feel that the internet is the new teacher and there's so much education. What stops us is our desire intent. What do you think education has been fundamentally, completely changed and disrupted by COVID? And if it has, what would you like the new to be implemented in the future of education?
Wow, that's a huge question. Okay, basically what I think is COVID is essentially accelerated a lot of things that would have probably taken about 5 to 10 years to happen, right? And all of that has kind of started happening in about 5 months right now. Okay, so let's actually think about this. We are actually dealing with students who are classified as millennials, right? So how do these millennials, the millennials essentially are characterized by ubiquitous availability of internet, very good bandwidth, a lot of information and so on. So how would a millennial basically look at teaching, right? So if you mentioned rote learning. So let's start with actually rote teaching. Fundamentally, what's been happening all these years, maybe centuries, is education has been more teaching centric. So a professor or a lecturer or a teacher would come to the classroom and he or she would deliver content, and students are sitting in front and they would just absorb. They may ask questions or they may not ask questions. And if they ask questions, the teacher may answer or may not answer. And if he or she answers, it may be correct or it may be incorrect. We don't know. Right? So, I mean, all of these things actually are a problem with the internet too. Like you can't get like so-called reliable information on the internet and so on. But fundamentally, it's like, if you're a student in some corner of the globe, you are kind of stuck with a particular person to be the one that teaches you something, and then your content, he or she is your content provider, and you would have to take that, right? So you don't really have a choice. Now what has happened is, this is even before COVID. As you said, there are a lot of this MOOCs and online material. So effectively, any student should be in a position to actually go and learn what they want from potentially the best professors in the world, but in a remote manner, right? So that is remote as in it's not online. So it may be material that's already been delivered and the content is there, and you're kind of like it's one-way street. So you just listen to what they have to say. Now this has now become like the norm. Today, online classes are the norm thanks to COVID, right? So going forward, what we expect is there will be a lot of ed tech companies that will actually crawl through the web for content and start looking at, let's say, video clips of the best professors mouthing the best, what do you call, concepts, right, in the best possible manner. And it's possible that there could be a lot of AI that gets into it in order to actually even down select which clipping is better than the other in terms of viewerships and ratings and all of that stuff, right? And you may now have like much more standardized course content that puts in the best of everything that is available on the internet in terms of video clips and text material, or let's say AR, VR material that is there that explains the concepts better in terms of animation. And so on. So what it essentially will do is it will now push the best teachers in the world up there, and it will now try to suppress all the not so good teachers around, right? So any good university, I mean, let's look at the university. If you're looking at college education, right? So I mean, we can also say all these things for school education, but school education is a little bit more messy when compared to college education because there's a lot of standardization that happens in college education. So it's easier to talk about. So in universities, like very good universities, like let's say the IITs and so on in India, the focus actually has been in the last few decades more towards research. So you will find university professors more interested in their research groups, their PhD students, their grants, the conferences that they go to, the papers that they publish, and all of that. And very frankly, many times you will find these very big, short professors known around the world just pay lip service to teaching. They just go to the class and then figure out what they need to talk about. They say something and then they hurriedly get out, and then there will be a teaching assistant who will do the chores behind to teach, to clarify the doubts to the students and so on, right? So all of that actually may go away. So you may simply find there's much better content than even the most famous professor can deliver, physically. So students will actually now be able to prefer those when compared, and then they will have all the AR, VR content integrated with it and all of that. So it will be a lot easier for students to learn from that than listening to this world-renowned professor who is actually teaching them live if he actually does a very lousy job. So then the question you have to ask is, then what happens to this one-on-one, like physical interaction, teaching, contact with these best professors and so on? So what do they do? Correct. So if students can actually learn everything from online, then what are the professors for? Right. Right. So suddenly professors find themselves out of job as far as the teaching is concerned, and they kind of got edged out by themselves because they were paying more attention to research. Right. So maybe that they deserved it. Right. So then the question is like, then what happens to education? Did it actually stop, or how is it going to evolve? Well, the good professors will continue to actually put more content and all of that, right? And the other professors will actually try to emulate them and become good and so on. So there will be some kind of a rewarding mechanism for people who are becoming popular teachers and so on. So the popularity of teachers is two ways. One is like good delivery of content. The second one is bringing in new content itself, right? So all of that stuff will actually get valued in the marketplace, so to speak. Then what does the university really do, right? So in the university, there are essentially two objectives that will be met. One, it simply brings bright and young minds together, right? So people go to university simply to meet other students so that they can actually work with them on some very cutting edge projects. For example, at IIT Madras, we do Hyperloop, right? It's a completely student driven project, right? So and then as a mentor, I keep trying to push them, saying that is it possible for a student project to actually see the light of day in a practical application in which we will be able to grow a project to the point where we are able to propose a Chennai to Bangalore in 15 minutes kind of a Hyperloop part, right, and the tube and so on. But it essentially germinated as a student project. So there are several such student projects that students get into, and that's where if you go to a name brand university, you actually get to really work on big ideas and be part of it. I believe that the kind of network that will happen either through LinkedIn or other college networks that may also come up like part of a social media will also be able to put students from across different universities to and institutions to actually work on projects collectively. Right? All these things essentially end up democratizing technology. Right? So it's all about what's called as democratizing technology. So, but people will still want to actually stay in these places where they can work together with their hands and exchange ideas very quickly without having to get on a Zoom call, right face to face, and then check out how things happen for themselves all together and so on. So bringing bright and young minds together is one thing that universities would do. The other thing that it would do, professors can actually act as mentors for these students to be able to actually undertake bigger and bigger projects. So if it's possible for them to actually come up with, like for example, Hyperloop, as I said, is one example. There are other examples that happen. Like for example, there is a Raftar team that actually puts together a Formula race car that goes every year to Germany and then wins like about the top 5 somewhere for the race car. This thing, and then similarly new tech, right? So you can now look at electric vehicles and all of that stuff. So for example, I have a bunch of startups. One of them is an electric plane company, right? So question is, can we make electric planes, and at what sizes can we make? So the professors will probably have to be in a position to mentor students, but the students can actually essentially learn by themselves with the content-rich internet that's available to them. So essentially then the focus now turns around to a learning-centric education rather than a teaching-centric. Right? So the students get to actually decide what they want to learn and how they want to learn and where they want to go seek that kind of information and so on. If they have any specific doubts, they can probably go up to a live professor and then ask him, look, this is what this guy is saying. Can you actually explain this better? Or something like that. But even then, I think they may be able to get more content in the web for clarifying their doubts. But fundamentally, all of that will be used for applying directly in practice on a daily basis on their big projects that they're working on. Right? So this is kind of like learning by doing as well as learning from the internet will be the norm. And the professors will simply have to be mentors. And that's how the situation is expected to pan out, in my opinion.
Right, beautiful. Right. So I completely with you with whatever you mentioned. Because I think we're living in fantastic times. These technologies. It's such a nascent stage. I mean, your AR, VR, MR, artificial intelligence. I guess. I mean, it's a tool. If we take it, it can evolve humanity to the next evolution, next level, and even the education. I mean, largely which has been on a linear pattern can completely evolve, and we will start solving problems rather than creating problems. We'll be creating a sustainable future. At this point in time, the world is in such a big mess because of the inequality, right? And there is so much these youngsters can do, right? You are an inspiring professor, because I've been following you, and there's very few professors who, while teaching, are also learning. So you are one of them who's mentoring so many startups. You are at the forefront of exponential technologies. You understand the importance of exponential technologies. So can you run my audience your journey from a professor to a mentor to a founder? Obviously, we'll get into your startups, which you mentioned about mentoring, about Avishkar, Hyperloop, and ePlane later. But I would love to hear your journey, from where you started.
First of all, what we have to understand that we are going through an era of very rapid changes. Right. So when I grew up, I was born in the very late 60s, and went through schooling in 70s and 80s, and went to college in the late 80s and did my PhD in the 90s. All that stuff looks very, very old. Okay, so it looks like it's like part of a different era. And when compared to what's happened in the 2000s and the 2000 teens, right? And going forward, it could be much more different and all of that. So it's very difficult to actually chalk out a journey for this kind of rapid change, right from the outset. I guess it's kind of like a temperament or whatever it is, right? So many times if I think back, I kind of come across in some sense like the character in this movie, Forrest Gump, right, where you have a goal and then you just keep going at it, right? So, for example, when I was in my undergrad, I was like a class topper. When I went to Georgia Tech for doing my PhD, I chose to specifically work with this person, my advisor, who was at that time the oldest rocket scientist in the world, right? And the best one, very acclaimed internationally. I remember still a South Korean tourist to Atlanta actually dropped by Georgia Tech with my advisor's office and took a picture with them. Okay, so it was like a celebrity that way for the aerospace rocket people, right? But he was already 70 years old, and then the student who was actually leaving him told me he had a heart attack at 52, and you want to be making sure that he's alive when you finish your PhD. So I just tried to get my master's and PhD in 4 years straight from my bachelor's. I worked like so hard to actually make that happen, right? And then I had already decided that I wanted to come back to teach exactly at this particular place I'm teaching for the last 23 years. I had decided my not only my job but also my employer. So I had to actually target my employer to make sure that he would actually pick me up when I'm ready. And they said that you need to have a postdoc experience. So I actually went and got a postdoc experience. So it's like everything, like, just do what it takes to get there. And similarly, if you now look at after getting here in about 10 years, I actually went through my assistant professor, associate professor, all of that stuff. And once that's done, so what next, right? So you're a full professor when you're 40 years old, and then you have like another 25 years of career to go through as a professor. What next? And then that's when the National Center for Combustion R&D happened, which is a fairly huge exercise. So cumulatively, since about 2012 to now, we have been able to attract about $30 million worth of research funding. So that's been a significant amount of time that I have put in developing a huge combustion center. And that's when the irony struck, right? So by 2016, there were two ironies about it. One is like we were developing innovations in the combustion center as mandated by the funding agency. And then we suddenly find that we are actually stuck with very, very big organizations and companies to which we can't push this tech if this has to see the light of day. And these big companies may not be able to actually absorb because they are already committed to what they're doing. They have put in their millions of dollars of investment in what they're doing for the next 5 years, 10 years. They think that they are the ones who are driving innovation, and they will tell us what we should be looking at and convey to the students. It's not a two-way street. So we can't go back and tell them innovations and so on. So that's when we started saying, let's actually look at startups to see if we can push these innovations. But that's when I had to then realize startups is not a joke, right? It's not simple. If you now have to actually push technological innovations, they have to be built around. There should be products that are built around those technologies, right? And we can't develop products that are of the order of like aircraft engines as big as that. We can't actually suddenly start up a GE, for example, right? So we have to start small. We have to start with small products, right? And those products then will have to have a business case. So where is the market for these? Who's going to buy these? At what price point, right? So then I had to actually learn a lot of entrepreneurship, and that was completely unexpected, right? So all this jargon about go to market and all these things that people now use in entrepreneurship, I had to actually learn all of that. I had no idea about all of this, right? In fact, until about 3-4 years back, I didn't even know what's the meaning of equity. Okay, so all these things we have to kind of learn on the go and fast. But as we did this, another thing actually opened up, which is, hey, shouldn't we actually be looking at making smaller products, even in the energy and transportation space, like small engines, small rockets, like small planes, and so on, And that can democratize technology much better when compared to how the 20th century has been patterned, where you have had these large corporations making large things like huge thermal power plants, very long cables that are running electricity, and then long pipelines carrying oil, and then there's huge refineries. The internet companies that we're talking about, like Facebook and all, they're all very big companies. But they have actually sort of basically grown by democratizing technology. They just open up a platform where the content is brought by somebody else, right? And then everybody thrives on that, and then somebody is making money, right? So you can have big companies, but the technology must be democratized, right? You need to allow for people to have choice in utilizing these technologies, and then that's where the marketplace, where you should be able to generate power in your own backyard and share it with your own community. You shouldn't have to depend on some power that's coming from somewhere spewing pollution, and so you will have choice, right? You will now say, no, I'll probably use a solar panel than actually depend on thermal power plant because I'll be clean, right? So if you now allow for people to choose the kind of technology that is allowed, then you probably can have a more sustainable future. So going back to the 20th century, the education model that we had at that time for universities was to simply put out graduates that will be picked up by the big companies. But today, that's getting saturated. So is it possible for us to be able to actually contrive graduates from out of our universities who will actually make their own companies and then employ their own set of people around in smaller groups that will actually develop a lot of new high-tech but small products that will democratize technology and bring it down to people? So this is a completely new paradigm, right? So that means that we can't be educating people. So if you're actually educating people for getting hired by big companies, then you can actually end up you can afford to do a lousy job in the university because the big company is going to actually pick this guy and train him anyway, right? So that's what's been happening, right? It's a sham. So if you now look at all the employers, they would say that, graduates are not market ready, they are not employable, we have to actually train them, put another 6 months or whatever it is. Whereas if you now say, no, each person should actually think about employing himself, right? You need to have a lot of startups, you need to have a lot of deep tech, small product companies that have to be formed. It's a completely different story. The student better learn what he has to learn properly, otherwise there is really no. So you have to shift the focus from these large corporations kind of thing to a lot of small companies and deep tech that gets pervasive everywhere. So this is what we have learned in the startups that we have had in Agnicol or Aerostovilos or ePlane or X2 Fuels that you have not mentioned is actually also pretty amazing, where we actually take unsegregated municipal solid waste and then try to make crude oil out of it, which means like you don't need to import crude oil from outside and refine it. We can actually use crude oil that's generated from within the society, right? All of these kinds of things are expected to make a huge societal impact. So these are all things that have evolved in the last few years for me in an unintended manner. That's how the journey has been for me. The other thing that also ironically happened was I was here trying to spend a lot of time trying to do combustion. And in 2016 is when I actually suddenly realized, wait a minute, the world is going towards electrification. If I actually miss that bus, I think I'm going to be a museum piece. So is it not possible for me to actually jump on that bandwagon? And most of the people were actually thinking about electric vehicles. So I said, how about actually electric aircraft? And that's when I started learning about electric aircraft. And as you rightly said, one of the tricks that good professors play is if they want to learn something, they actually offer to teach it. Right? And it's kind of like a gamble that we play. But it's an elective course, so it's okay. We can learn. We can get the students to learn along with us. And I did actually learn about electric propulsion. Now offered a full-fledged semester-long course on it for the first time in the world. So again, and that was actually the foundation for my ePlane company. So this is how all these things have worked together for me in the last. And sure enough, the last few years I've been seeing a lot more rapid changes with me than what's happened in the last 10, 20 years.
Lovely, lovely. How cool is that? I mean, you're smartly leveraging NCCRD's research work into the startups, and that's the best possible case scenario, right? So can you talk to us about how your research work at the NCCRD, which is the world's largest combustion research center, right? So the research and the advances of there, how are you leveraging in the startups?
Fundamentally, the NCCRD actually, to me, stands for being able to think big. So when, and I mean, as I said, I was actually this nerdy professor who was just focusing on his career progression like a typical an academic would. And that's when the opportunity of having to set up the combustion center came, and the government basically said, here is a lot of funding that we can give you, but put together a very credible proposal. And I was at the forefront of trying to get a nice proposal done, and still we got a lot of flack because the proposal was still too nerdy. And the government agency essentially said you need to be doing grand challenges in combustion that are of practical importance. So they actually set the bar high, and then we met that up, right? So it's all about actually beginning to think big. So when we thought, so one of the things about combustion is that you have a lot of multi-physics going on there, like chemical reactions, then the fluid mechanics, a lot of things are actually happening, right? So typically engine companies will, whether it is automobile engines or whether it's aircraft engines or any engines, they will not really look at academic research very seriously because you cannot scale them properly. So many of these things are happening at high pressure, high temperature. It's very difficult to actually reproduce things in an academic laboratory unless you have the kind of depth of funding that the NCCRD afforded. So the ones NCCRD could afford that kind of funding, we could set up facilities that the industry was beginning to take note of because that was actually becoming very relevant to the industry. So what we could do now could be directly scaled to industry level because we were doing more realistic conditions and realistic scales. So it was all about thinking big. And that's where when these innovations happened and then when we wanted to push them back to the industry, I felt that, it's better to actually go through the startups. And that's where the Aerostovilos startup actually started. In fact, pretty much everything that we're doing obviously has a research bearing, right? So the Aerostovilos has the lean direct injection technology that we developed that has gone into it. Agnikul is essentially using these 3D printed rockets, right, where we were actually testing 3D printed combustors and burning fuel over extended periods of time and newly developed technology for 3D printing combustors with metal, right? And Agnikul essentially got away doing Inconel engines, whereas we were actually looking at some Hastelloy engines and so on, right? So, but the technology is essentially the same. You can essentially do the heat transfer calculations for the other material and all of that. So Agnikul essentially got emboldened by the fact that we were doing the 3D printed combustor research, and they could then say, let's actually also try 3D printed rockets. So that is where the research was helping. The center has actually helped in letting them characterize their injectors, fuel injectors, and all of that because they had the facilities to do so. But it's not like what we did as a research was feeding into it. But at the same time, the other thing that happened on the E-plane was my own research where I was moving away from combustion to electric planes, where we had started looking at how to extend range of the plane with electric planes or whatever it is. And then I also taught the course, as I said. So all of the learnings that I did as a professor was feeding into E-planes. Similarly, extractive fuels is actually the research that's being done by one of my colleagues in chemical engineering who is part of the NCCRD on trying to use waste for making crude oil and all of that. So that all of that research essentially directly gets into these startups. So what I'm currently thinking is it will be really nice if, let's understand, engineering research is all about engineering. And engineering is all about products. So if it's possible for us to do what's called as translational research, which means that you do research with a specific goal of trying to implement that in a product that has a commercial value, right? And try to do it with a startup in such a way that this can be easily done, and that can allow a lot of universities to become product development centers. You don't have to actually go to a very big company in order to be able to produce big products anymore. With 3D printing and AI and stuff, you can do a lot at a small level and at a much more distributed level, right? Internet of Things, you can pick data from everywhere and then synthesize all of that. A lot of things can be done in a my way of actually looking at what is called as large scale is not doing big things anymore. Like what, like the typical 20th century being an American century, you go to America, you'll see everything big, right? That's what I used to feel when I went there in the 90s, right? But no, it could be an Indian century where we actually do a large number of small things to actually make up for the big scale. So there are like lots of community power generation centers, and there are community waste management centers. So we don't really have landfills anymore. We can, generate our own power without having to depend on the grid and so on, right? So you figure out how to get your own water. You figure out how to get your own power. You figure out how to dispose your toilet, right? So don't depend on municipalities to function properly and all of that stuff. So this is a nice way of actually getting out of all this corruption or a lot of that stuff. So technology is the one that's actually going to push the boundaries of how people live very comfortably in a very affordable manner by themselves. This is the way I look at it.
Lovely. Yes, I think technology is in the space where it's growing exponentially, and you rightfully pointed out, all of these technologies are converging, and it can help the humans. I mean, and we need to adopt innovation. And keep on solving problems. So I mean, you spoke about your ePlane AI. So where are you? What stage are you in? What's the team strength, and what's the plan ahead with ePlane AI?
So our path is actually a three-level path. And what we have already done is to develop a plane, which is a VTOL plane. VTOL stands for vertical takeoff and landing.
Right.
So effectively, this plane would actually look like a drone if you look from the bottom with all those quadcopters and stuff. But it'll look like a plane looking from the top. So this is what we call as a VTOL fixed wing hybrid. The fixed wing actually stands for how a plane looks like with its wings that are fixed, as opposed to what's called the rotary wing that used to be like describing helicopters. But today we have these multi-copters. It's not like a single helicopter blade that is turning around. You have these multiple rotors that are forming like a drone, right? And that is basically facilitated by the fact that we are doing electric. So if you had a single combustion engine, like what we would have until now, you will have a single shaft that would come out of it, and then that would turn a single propeller with a gearbox and stuff. Everything becomes very heavy. It's very hard to miniaturize all of this. And then a helicopter, for example, has this fairly large rotor blade, and then it goes fart, right? So it actually chops the air, and therefore it's called a chopper. It makes a lot of noise. Now, we want to see if we can take off vertically and land vertically in cities so that we can do air taxis. And we can essentially bring down the commute time down to about 10 minutes from anywhere to anywhere across any busy city. So that our goal here, or mission in life, so to speak, is to eradicate traffic, right? So we just don't want anybody to get stuck in traffic at all, right? Which essentially means that they should be going from point to point, doorstep to doorstep in about 10 minutes, which means that they should be able to take off vertically and land vertically and so on, right? So this is going to be very difficult if you use helicopters because they will make a lot of noise, and that's going to cause a lot of noise pollution in an urban setting. So people have been extremely conscious about it, particularly in the West. And so they try to reduce the size of the rotor into a large number of smaller rotors. Again, it's kind of like so in fact, the term that I coined for this democratizing technology, making large number of small things instead of one big thing and all those things, is what is called as infrastructure. So we essentially challenge the notion that we need to have large infrastructure for economic development, right? So a sustainable development can be attained by a completely different path called infrastructure. So in some sense, what the noise reduction strategy in electric plane is to kind of defrastructurize the propulsion. That means you put a large number of small rotors and have small motors that are connecting them and running them. And all you have to do is to run wires from the battery, right? And that is easier to do than actually having mechanical transmission of shaft power and all of that stuff. All of that is enabled in these rotors that are allowed for vertical takeoff, like in drone. And then once you take up there, now if you were to actually continue with the drone, and that's possible. So you can actually have a cabin in which people can sit, and then it can be attached to like one big drone with large number of rotors and so on. There are implementations of that kind that have also come to the market now, right? What the problem with that is a helicopter as well as these distributed rotors for vertical takeoff, they are meant for primarily staying up in the air. And you need to have them run continuously all the time at full power in order to balance the weight. Whereas what we are talking about is to have wings, when if you now go forward, and you need to go at a fairly good speed now, if you go forward, the wings can now start generating the lift like in a conventional plane and hold the plane up in the air as it moves forward. And the power that you're spending is only to overcome the wind resistance. And typically the wind resistance is about a tenth of the weight of the aircraft itself. So it doesn't make sense for us to actually have these rotors operate all the time in order to hold the plane up and then go forward in a very Herculean manner. But we try to actually have these wings do the job with a forward rotor that is pushing like a conventional aircraft. So you can take off like a drone, but actually go like a plane. And this is this is the fundamental unit of what we are trying to do. And there is a lot of AI built into this also, because you need to actually look at obstacles and then be able to avoid them. And so there are like 3 layers of control over here. One is the navigation itself. So you now have a flight path that will go through that you specify, and it can autonomously navigate itself through those waypoints. That's the outer level of control. Then you have obstacles that might come in the way, and you have to duck those obstacles and come back to the path that you had determined before. So that is where a lot of AI comes in, computer vision comes in, cameras and LiDARs or radars, all of that stuff. Those sensors will have to be there and so on. And then the third level of control is to stabilize the aircraft from any gusts and any disturbances in the wind and all of that stuff. So that, as well as the wings and the rotors together, is all what the electric plane is all about. We have done a implementation of this for a plane that looks like a little bit bigger than a tabletop, like about 1.4 meters wingtip to wingtip and about 1.1 meter from nose to tail, to carry between 2 to 6 kgs of payload, right? And we were actually trying to get this ready for a lot of e-commerce deliveries that could happen, and that's what we were actually envisaging. And maybe after that, we will actually get to see pizzas delivered at home by drones and so on, maybe next year. But so we were kind of like a little early last year when we tried to make this winged drone, if you will, right? Because that can actually go very large distances. The normal drone, for example, even what Amazon put together last year, the new version that they came up with after 3 years of originally talking about using drones is right now is capable of actually going about 24 kilometers with about, I think, 2 kgs or 5 kgs. I don't remember that number right now. So they could do that. But what we are talking about is somewhere up to 6 kgs we can take and go 40 kilometers, or with the 2 kg we can actually go to even 100 kilometers. Which also essentially means that if I'm only doing 10 kilometer trips, right, I don't have to actually swap or recharge my battery every 10 kilometers or 15 kilometers or 20 kilometers. I'll be able to do about 4 or 5 trips before I can actually recharge my battery. So that means I save on my battery cost, because the battery will last only for so many number of recharge cycles, right? So and then that cost curve is something that we have to be very conscious about in electric vehicles. So we did this. The next thing that we are actually just about starting to do is the next level subscale version, which is a vehicle we call E50. The previous one we have just called E6, going by the payload capacity. So the E50 is supposed to be able to take about 50 kg payload and go about 200 kilometers now at a speed of kilometers per hour. And so we now are looking at the next level, and this would be the size of a car. We expect like about 3 meter wingspan and a similar such nose to tail distance and so on. So that's again like a plane. And here now we will actually be looking at engines that are more compact and also reducing noise when compared to what we did with the E6 with the naked propellers, like the drones. Here it's not going to be drones, it's going to be what's called as ducted fans that we want to be developing. So this process of developing this has commenced, and we expect to actually finish this by next April. That's our current plan. And then push it out to flight tests and then certification and so on, and look for markets where it can be deployed, not just in India, but also abroad and so on. While there, we want to actually slowly ramp up our design for the 2-seater aircraft, which would again be the same configuration. So it's essentially a scaled up version. So you have the wings and these ducted fans, maybe larger number of ducted fans to meet the thrust requirement for liftoff and forward flight. Sometime towards the later half of next year is when we will start making the plane, fabricating that plane, the two-seater version. So we have to pay a lot of attention to the interiors now. You have a cabin with two seats, and initially we want to actually go for a piloted version, a human piloted version. So the pilot controls what are the human factors that go with it, what are the certification requirements for that, as well as for the aircraft performance, what are the redundancies that are required for a manned aircraft, and so on. So all of these things will be factored in, so that will take a little longer, and then we start fabricating it. So sometime in 2022, early 2022, hopefully if everything goes well, is when we will actually start doing the flight test of that for certification. And there again, since we are actually working on all these smaller planes, they're all autonomously piloted. We can actually have an autonomous piloted version for cargo of about 200 kgs. That's equivalent to about two passengers. And then we will also have the passenger version where we will have a human piloted test pilot, pilot the plane and go through certification process. And then we will have to switch back to autonomous when certification agencies are confident enough, people are confident enough to get into a pilotless plane, so to speak, right? So there again, we said that we will actually have a two-seater for even a pilotless plane, so that there is a psychological comfort that people have that they will have one more companion in the plane. Otherwise, it could have been a single-seater plane, because if you look at most Uber rides, they're all like single-passenger rides, Uber or Ola rides. So likewise, we could actually have had a single-seater itself. In fact, one of the Chinese versions, they started with a single-seater and now they're going to two-seater.
Right.
So we can actually have a human pilot. But we decided right from the beginning that people may not be comfortable traveling alone, and therefore we actually look for two seats. That's how it is.
Lovely. Lovely. Super awesome. How cool is that? And I think it's the best way to start with delivery drones, and then you get into passenger aircraft. Like you mentioned, there's a Chinese company, I think Xang, who's looking at VTOLs. Uber has got a VTOL. Kitty Hawk has a VTOL. I never thought that somebody in India would be looking at a VTOL, and I'm so super excited for vertical takeoff and landing machine. And I think, rather than having autonomous vehicles, we're working on the autonomous vehicle, which is going to be pretty much difficult for the Indian roads to handle. I think autonomous aircraft, especially an electric plane, I think would be the future of transport. It could open up the transportation, and I see that as a beautiful future. Now, talking about transport, you are also mentor for Avishkar Hyperloop, right? So could you talk about Avishkar Hyperloop, and do you see Hyperloop becoming a reality? At this point in time in Maharashtra, I think Virgin Hyperloop is talking to the Maharashtra government for the Bombay-Pune corridor, and they're saying that they'll have a test track by 2025, and maybe like another 5 years they'll have a complete Bombay to Pune corridor ready. When do you see Hyperloop becoming a reality, and what part or what role do you see Avishkar Hyperloop playing over there?
Just to start by answering that by quoting Bill Gates, who is supposed to have said long back that people over-predict what's going to happen in 2 years, but grossly under-predict what's going to happen in 10 years. So it's very difficult to actually see what will happen in 10 years. But that's exactly where the crux is. For kind of things that we are doing, we're always looking at a 10-year period to bring about a change. In fact, my approach is a lot of things that we're doing should actually change the way the next generation behaves with respect to technology, right? So it's going to be a generational change that we have to bring in. So in this case of Hyperloop, we expect like about a 10-year period is when things can actually become a reality, simply because you need to be able to run these vacuum ducts right over very long distances and so on. So that is the thing. So in that sense, it's kind of like infrastructure intensive is what it would look like. But just like how, just like I have to dial back to the E-plane story, right? We have certain theses that are counterintuitive, and that's also true with Hyperloop. That's the reason why I'm kind of dialing back. So there are certain theses that are kind of very counterintuitive. For example, we think that passenger aircraft, which are air taxis, may be allowed even earlier than delivery drones. Okay, and that's because helicopters today exist, and people would actually, and certification agencies as well as people would want a continuity in change, right? Whereas a lot of these small drones, they're okay for like wedding photographs and all of that, but for them to be crisscrossing the skies because small ones are actually something a lot of people can put together very easily, right? So you will suddenly find the sky's flooded with this, and you will have crashes, and then they come crashing on somebody's head, and so people will be a lot more cautious. So you will find that people carrying vehicles who can be far fewer because they can actually do the trip in 10 minutes. What is going to take you an hour or hour and a half in Bangalore, right? So that means like on the whole, about 100 e-planes can actually do the job of about 1,000 taxis, right? So you see the point. That means like the crowd, the cities, the skies won't be crowded. And it would be a lot easier for them to actually implement that when compared to drones. That is one counterintuitive stuff, right? The second counterintuitive stuff is it's probably a lot easier to actually bring in autonomous planes when compared to autonomous cars, because autonomous cars face a lot more hurdle, right? When compared to autonomous planes in the sky, you can have several layers of corridors, air corridors, and all of that to differentiate them and so on, right? So of course, there's a lot more safety consciousness in there. And then if you're able to meet those safety standards, bingo, right? We can actually go forward with that. So these are all very, very and the other counterintuitive that you pointed out, right? So India is actually a nice place for us to actually bring in these technologies, because this is where the pain point is actually the most, right? So you might find that Indians actually start flying a lot more when compared to other people, right? So this could be quite counterintuitive if you're able to bring the price point appropriately. So similarly, in the case of Hyperloop, right, the counterintuitive thing is when compared to a high-speed rail track which has to be perfectly aligned, right, for the high-speed train to work, it's sufficient if this tube that we're talking, the vacuum tube that we're talking about, need not be exactly circular, and so there can be deformities, right? So we can typically be okay with like an Indian kind of Hyperloop, right? And that'll be okay, because the vehicle is not going to touch any of these things. It's actually levitating. Right. So if it is levitating and then it's kind of like doing a little bit this way, that way, it's okay. Of course, going at a very high speed, right? So you want to make sure that it doesn't really crash, but there is a levitation that's making sure that's happening. It's not going to go hit the roof. It's not going to go hit the sides. There are guides that do this. So it's okay if this tube is not like very, very perfect. Okay. So that way, it will not be as much of an infrastructure intensive thing as, let's say, a high-speed rail track. That said, you still have to actually put them. Like if you have to go from Chennai to Bangalore or Bangalore to Bombay or something, you have to have these tracks. You have to worry about how this turning happens at these very high speeds and all of those things. So those things have to be perfected. So when Elon Musk, for example, in SpaceX, right, when they were running this competition for about 3-4 years, they stopped it. They stopped it last year, even before the pandemic. And they basically said that they are actually trying to increase the track length from 1 mile to something like 10 miles. So they're actually trying to find some 10-mile long track where they would put this thing and so on. I don't know if they're going to resume the competition based on that and so on. I understand they would. So the competition actually got disrupted. So while there was like some Arizona University that was actually trying to run a competition, but they were not having any duct and all of that. So they said they would just do a rail in which you could have a pod run on wheels, which I said that they're going to do that, we can do it ourselves. So we were actually, just before the pandemic, by about February 28th or so, we were actually putting out a global competition at IIT Madras, okay, like what the Arizona State University was doing, or University of Arizona, I don't know, right? So they were doing, right? And our goal is to see if we can actually do at least half of what SpaceX has done, which means that we have a duct, we have a vacuum tube, and we bring people with different pods. And allow for them to raise and all of that stuff. It's one of the things. The second thing is that gives us like a nice test bed for us to test a lot of technologies in about a half a kilometer track. But the problem with that is, and that's something that we can actually manage we have a satellite campus where there is some space for about half a kilometer at a stretch where we could manage this. But that's not going to actually let us reach top speeds, because we'll have to decelerate before you reach there. So if we are able to show that, then we can actually get a lot of interest. Already there is a lot of interest from a lot of big companies, right? Like steel companies, automotive companies, construction companies. A lot of them actually are coming behind us saying, is it possible for us to, sponsor something or whatever it is, right? So we could actually gather all of them, maybe form an industry academia consortium, go to the government, get some funding, so that we can actually do a 10-kilometer track. And while there, we can also try to partner with any of those other world players who are into this Maharashtra project, for example, right? And so on. So why would we do that? Is because collaboration is always easy, so that we can actually cut down the time it takes for development. But one of the key things that we have to understand that we have leveraged in Agnikul, for example, is Indian tech. So when Indians develop this tech, it actually can be done at a very dirt cheap level, right? So we want to actually bring down the cost of development of Hyperloop so that it becomes very affordable. And we have benchmarked the costs that we have projected against what are the global benchmarks on Hyperloop, and we are certainly a shade cheaper when compared to what we have confidence that we can actually do this significantly cheaper when compared to others. So either by collaboration instead of competition, that would be preferred, or at least we should be in a position to actually put out our own technology when compared to others in an extremely competitively priced manner. For a 10-kilometer ride, as a demonstration, like what they are actually doing in Maharashtra, and then progressively now get into a project where you would actually connect Chennai and Bangalore in 15 minutes, kind of thing, right? So this is the roadmap that we have. The question we're not sure in this pandemic situation is how long this roadmap will take. I think we can probably get there in about 5 years to get to the full-scale implementation between two cities. What do you mean? Like the half a kilometer and the 10-kilometer, all of that can be done within 5 years, and we can have a blueprint ready for launching the full project for at least one pair of cities in about 5 years. That's very tangible to think about. But the actual project, which will carry people, will probably start in 5 years, and then the construction should take another whatever time it takes, maybe another 5 years or so for people to start riding. That's where I'm saying it should take 10 years. That's the kind of outlook we have.
Lovely. So you've been one of the pioneers when it comes to combustion. So how is Agnikul and ISRO or ISRO leveraging that? Because at this point in time, you see that there's a global space race, right? Soon I think that the space economy is going to be somewhere around $1 trillion business, right? And it's not just for exploration. There people are actually looking at getting some money because there's mining resources available over there. Plus, besides that, there's this Amazon, SpaceX, OneWeb. Even Apple is jumping out of the bandwagon because they are flooding the sky with satellites. So there's this huge business opportunity. So yeah, talk to us a little bit about Agnikul and what are you doing here?
So Agnikul is again exemplifying deep infrastructure in many ways, right? So if you look at the space race of the 20th century, it was between nations, right? And primarily, it was all about setting an altitude record, go to the moon, one off, maybe about let's say 3-4 sorties, and then say, okay, we have been there, done that, kind of thing. And so the Russians took it quite seriously and then set up a space station ahead of everybody else, and they had a lot of experience doing that. But they actually were sticking to the low Earth orbit and having human habitat in space and so on. But fundamentally, what you will see is that it's Americans doing this, Russians doing this, and so on. That's exactly like what I said about the 20th century having all these big corporations to which universities would put out their graduates for the job market. That's changing now. We are now basically saying that everybody should actually create their own job. That's what I'm trying to push. So that's exactly where it's no longer like a nation-specific space race. The space race is all about commercialization as far as we can see. But there is also the deep space mission component, which is about exploration. And even there, you actually find quite a few private companies, particularly even startups, are getting interested. And then there are these fairly ultra high net worth individuals who are interested in putting in money in them, like Jeff Bezos has his own company, or all of the other people who are having big deep pockets, essentially can put in money for even deep space. Now, the interesting thing is ISRO, for example, has been working with IIT Madras for their research for a very long time. And similarly, they have been working with private companies for a very long time. ISRO is a fantastic example of how to leverage everything that's available to tap and use it. So they are actually a fairly nimble and frugal organization. In fact, I think I've said this in a TED talk before as well, that ISRO has been practicing frugal engineering long before Tata came up with Nano and made frugal engineering a buzzword. And what we are now talking about is people like Agnikul trying to actually make space access even more frugal, right? And that's primarily made by things like 3D printing. If you're now able to actually do 3D printed rockets, and here again, starting small is actually very useful, right? So if you look at when Agnikul started about 2-3 years back, the build volume for doing a 3D printed metal was of the order of about I think a quarter meter cube was something that was very common, was just about coming there, but half a meter cube was not something that was unheard of. So they configured their rockets to actually fit that kind of a build volume. But today we are now looking at build volumes that are like 3/4 meter cube being commonplace and 1 meter cube becoming something that's not unheard of. So they can easily scale this particular rocket that they have, the rocket engine, that they will now sort of copy paste and cluster, right, in a modular manner and configure the entire rocket for the particular payload. So one of the things that we have been able to actually achieve with these liquid rockets is a very flat cost curve that is very hard for anybody in the competition to beat. What that really means is we are configuring the rocket for a 100 kg payload to go to lower orbits, right? Now, if you look at how rockets have built, like let's say, for example, if followed ISRO, right, in their own history, they started with an SLV, which was capable of carrying a 40 kg payload to low Earth orbit. Then they did the ASLV by actually putting the first stage. They just copy pasted. Copy paste, of course, is like more modern jargon and compared to those times. It's not exactly copy paste, right? So, they put two strap-ons to actually increase the lift-off thrust so that they could put a 160 kg payload. That was the ASLV. And these actually became the strap-ons for the PSLV. Now you have the 6 strap-ons of a PSLV are essentially the first stage of the ASLV or the SLV. So then the rocket essentially became big. So it's like what was like a Raptor now became a T-Rex, right? So that's the way they actually grew. So it's sort of easy for us to think about growing a rocket in size, adding more and more of the elements around. What we are talking about is subtracting the rocket. From the 100 kg payload, is it not possible for us to actually remove these engines and then get smaller clusters to work with and also tailor the amount of propellant that you're going to take so that we will be able to actually take a 30 kg payload without them having to wait for another 3 more such satellites to come and be put in the payload bay, right? I should be able to actually offer the same price point on a per kg basis for the dollars that I'm charging for the 30 kg satellite guy as much as the 100 kg satellite guy, or I'll be going at a loss, right? So tightening the business case and trying to configure the rocket and also launching it from a mobile launch pedestal, which can be now configured. All I need is a barren ground. For example, today InSpace has come up and then ISRO is essentially offering their launch port for us to launch, but not necessarily a launch pad, because they would essentially say our launch pods are actually configured for our launch vehicles, right? So we are launching PSLV and GSLV Mark II and GSLV Mark III now, and we are going bigger. And of course, they have a small satellite launch vehicle, which is a solid rocket, completely all solids rocket. This thing, and then they are actually trying to come up with a launch port in somewhere deep south in Tamil Nadu, right? But they will not have liquid propellant storage facilities and all of that stuff out there. And the launch pad will be configured for their launch vehicle. So they would basically say, I can give you a piece of land for you and maybe a power connection or something, right? But you will have to actually figure out your own launch pad. It's not like we are actually going to go and build a launch pad out there. We will simply move trucks, right? So all you have to do is to give me barren land, and I will actually move in there like a marriage hall, right, with all my stuff, right? Do the launch, and then if you want me to disappear, I can actually pack my bags and put them in the container trucks and move out, right? That level of nimbleness is something that is now coming to you. That is where we are talking about this democratizing technology and all, right? That means you tell me that you have a satellite that I have to launch, which is either 30 kg or 40 kg, 50, 60, whatever number, I will be able to actually charge you the same rate on a per kg basis, right? And I'll be able to configure my rocket and get that rocket done in about a couple of weeks, launch it for you. No waiting time. So this is the pain point that we are actually trying to solve. This is now the new space race. How to simplify access to space is actually the new race that we are talking about. Right? This has got nothing to do with nations, nothing to do with nationalities and stuff. And this will actually penetrate to deep space missions too. So we are already working on technologies to go to the moon, okay, and do it very, very cheaply.
Right.
So that's where, I'm actually pretty happy that we are sitting in India, because India has a very good brand name for space thanks to ISRO, and that exists in this country for us to be able to actually come up with tech that is superior and the best in the world, and we can actually stand a good chance in terms of making a good business case. So it's not about national pride or achieving some scientific goals and all of that. So we will actually make business case in our lives.
Right. How cool is that? And I'm so enjoying this conversation because I see the passion in you. You are mentoring these really bold and audacious startups. A problem with India is, with the investors, I see that they are investing in startups with the low-hanging fruits. While as you, when I'm having a conversation with you, I'm getting a little lost because you have your hands full. You have your hands in Avishkar Hyperloop. You have a hand Agnikul. You have a hand full with your E-Plane AI and Aristo, which we have not even spoken about. And you are push driving for anyone and everyone to be an entrepreneur and think big and not restrict themselves. And because I think the future is super awesome. All of these technologies, if you leverage, you can build beautifully. Like you said, Agnikul is using 3D printing to build 3D printers to build rockets. And what that's going to do, it's going to democratize technology. I think we are at the cusp of entering the future of abundance. All our wars have been fought because of scarcity, and there is this wrong notion which is being spread to the world that we have a lack of resources, which is completely untrue. Because if you see, our world is full of resources, and somehow it's not. There's large inequality over there because 1% of the global population owns the entire 90% of the wealth. But now, if you're an entrepreneur, you can change that. You have the option to sit any corner of the world and use the resources which the internet has and connect with people like you and build innovation. So I'm super excited about the future, and it's really a pleasure and honor to speak to you. So, your last views to our listeners, and what is your moonshot? What comes next? But somehow all have been your moonshot. Whatever you've been doing is a moonshot. But what are you most excited for, and what are you looking for in the future?
See, the word moonshot is something. It's actually a bad word. Okay, so let's understand that, right? So you can actually use the moonshot in a nice manner if resources are actually at your disposal, right? So when somebody is actually saying that I'm actually after a moonshot, they are making fun of me, basically saying that I'm actually after something that may not work, that may not happen, right? That's kind of like what's meant by a moonshot. Whereas what we are actually trying to do is, unless there is a business case for doing what we are doing, and we are seeing a line of sight to be able to finish what we are doing after taking it up, right? We need to have the numbers worked out in the equations, and the simulations and all of that stuff should actually say that it is possible. Err on the safer side, exactly like what ISRO has been doing, by the way, right? So ISRO has been working very cash-strapped budgets, right? So in fact, the more cash-strapped you are, right, the more frugal you get and the more brainy you get. So I mean, your brains will have to ooze all your neurons only if you are actually starved with money, right? So that's why necessity is the mother of invention. How do you actually look at shortcuts that will actually work out in the long run? And that itself is actually kind of whatever I just said is actually contradictory. Right? So, but that's exactly where you need to apply brains, right? So you need to become very smart, very brainy when you actually are not looking for a lot of capital. So we are typically capital starved, not because there is lack of capital, but lack of confidence in ourselves to be able to actually put that capital to use, right? So that's actually our curse that we have been working with. We just don't have confidence that we can do things. In this climate, we have to show that we are doing these things, and which essentially means that it's very important that we actually show a business case for what we are doing and the line of sight to be able to achieve that in a technically feasible manner, right? And the business case is essentially going to show the economic feasibility. So all of these things will have to tie together, and that's where I would actually hate to use moonshots. But that said, yes, there are lots of other things that we can actually think about. Like, for example, today, when compared to what it used to be about 30, 40 years back in Ronald Reagan's times that NASA was trying to do, where they were talking about going from New York to Tokyo in 4 hours, we can actually think about going from Chennai to San Francisco in 4 hours with a hypersonic flight. We at IIT Madras, we have been working on, and at NCCRD, we have been working on technology that actually pertains to this. And in India, for example, we have had ISRO demonstrate this supersonic flight with some world records that they have actually beaten. And similarly, DRDO has their own, such work that they have done with liquid fuels, right, where they have shown prolonged duration. I think they'll probably do a flight test very soon as well, and so on. So the technological expertise actually is available in the country, including IIT Madras, where we have done these kinds of things. And there is a far more development that has happened in the last 30, 40 years in this realm. So one of the next things that we should probably be looking at is how is it possible for us to go from Chennai to San Francisco in 4 hours? That could be like the next big thing that we want to work on. So fundamentally, in COVID, coming back to COVID, right, what has it really taught us? It essentially has demolished distances, right? People can actually talk to each other across any distances. They don't need to travel. So it's a huge challenge to transportation itself. Right? So people can actually ask the question, why is this guy actually breaking his head for all this e-plane or this, going from one place to the other in 10 minutes or going from one city to the other in 15 minutes, creating an intercity metro with Hyperloop and so on. The point essentially is, if I have to now work on transportation technology, it better be really, really out of the world and really be cutting edge that compels people to say, yes, I think it's sufficient, it's okay to travel now because it's just going to happen 10 minutes across the city, 15 minutes between cities, and 4 hours. Right? We kind of put the boundaries on transportation so that we can overcome the reluctance for people to travel because they're always a Zoom call away. So this is the challenge that we are actually looking at, and we have to gear up for that challenge.
Lovely. Super, super, super. Thank you. Wishing you the very best with all that you do. It's a pleasure and honor to talk to you. I've done close to around 50 or 60 interviews on Change and Possible podcast, but talking to you, I feel that there's so much that I've missed out. I wish I could sit with you and spend a day, learn from you, understand your energy, because you are so passionate. It cuts across, and you, like I said, I'm going to take that word again, that you are a bold, visionary, audacious entrepreneur, innovator, professor. And I think we need more people like you in a country to drive the innovation, because I think that's the only way we will be able to reverse the impact of COVID-19. We are living in an exciting time. All of these technologies are tools which we can leverage and enter into the beautiful, like the fourth industrial revolution or singularity, which is just waiting for us. So thank you, and it's a pleasure and honor to speak to you. Really, really appreciate you giving the time. And to my listeners, if you like and hear what you see, please press the subscribe button. Until next time, see you guys. Bye bye. Thank you. Really appreciate it.
Thank you very much. Thank you.